we have been able to gather lots of new information. Now we understand that Anatolia and the Anatolian people played an extremely important role in the Neolithic revolution.
For centuries, the Minoan civilization of Crete has fascinated historians and archaeologists with its stunning palaces, vibrant art, and undeciphered writing. But despite all the discoveries, the true origins of these ancient people have remained a mystery until now. What if everything we thought we knew about where the Minoans came from was about to be overturned? New breakthroughs in DNA research are rewriting the story entirely, revealing connections that challenge long-held beliefs about migration and influence in the ancient Mediterranean. Could this island culture have been more homegrown and innovative than anyone dared imagine? The Minoan mystery deepens. For over a century, the origins of the Minoan civilization have remained an enigma wrapped in layers of history and myth. Nestled on the island of Crete, these people built a remarkable society filled with grand palaces, vibrant art, and complex culture. Yet, despite their visible achievements, exactly who the Minoans were, where they came from, and how they emerged remained uncertain. Scholars could only piece together fragments of their story, guessing at migrations, influences, or indigenous beginnings. It was a puzzle that defied straightforward answers. Archaeologists have uncovered magnificent ruins like Knossos, filled with maze-like corridors and colorful frescoes. But beyond the artifacts lay deep questions. Were the Minoans a native people who evolved on Crete, or were they newcomers who arrived from faraway lands? For years, these questions fueled intense debate. Traditional history suggested that complex civilizations had to come from the great cradles of civilization like Egypt or Mesopotamia, and perhaps the Minoans were no exception. Still, the Minoan culture seemed unique, filled with symbols and art, unlike those on the mainland or anywhere else. The problem was compounded by their undeciphered writing system, Linear A. Without readable texts, the Minoans could not simply tell us their story. Archaeologists had to interpret their culture through buildings, pottery, and frescoes. These clues hinted at a civilization advanced beyond its time, yet silent on its own origins. How did such sophistication rise on this isolated island in the middle of the Aegean Sea? It seemed like a mystery meant for legend rather than science. For much of the 20th century, theories about Minoan origins were mostly shaped by perception and assumption rather than hard evidence. Some scholars favored ideas of foreign migration or invasion to explain their artistic style and architectural complexity. Others argued the Minoans could be descendants of early farmers who had lived in the region for thousands of years. Yet, neither side had definitive proof to settle the question. This deadlock left the story of the Minoans suspended in a frustrating limbo. The mystery deepened further because Crete sits at a unique crossroads where three continents meet. From this island, one could sail to Africa, Asia, or Europe. This strategic location invited a range of influences, but also made it difficult to pinpoint which cultures contributed directly to Minoan development. The sea connected Crete to great networks of trade, ideas, and migration, blurring the lines between local innovation and foreign inspiration. This geographic crossroads complicated attempts to trace their true roots. At times, the Minoans seemed almost otherworldly. Their artwork celebrated life, nature, and the sea rather than warfare or conquest, a rare depiction in ancient cultures. They created luxurious frescoes of bull leaping, dances, and ceremonies bathed in color and motion. This joyful embrace of life contrasted sharply with the fortress-building, warrior-focused cultures nearby. It hinted at a society built on different values and perhaps a different origin story. But before exploring these genetic revelations, we need to understand the world the Minoans lived in. Ancient Crete's gleaming palaces. When you imagine ancient Crete, it's impossible to ignore the grandeur of its palaces, which towered as centers of power, art, and culture. The most famous among these was Knossos, often described as a labyrinth of majestic halls, stairways, storerooms, and painted corridors. These palaces were unlike many others in the ancient world. They were not built for defense. Instead, they felt open, welcoming, and alive with color and movement. Their design alone hints at a society prosperous and sophisticated. Besides Knossos, palaces at Phaistos and Malia rose in grandeur, each complex with advanced drainage systems, courtyards, and storerooms that revealed a high degree of architectural knowledge. The absence of massive walls or heavy fortifications puzzled archaeologists. Unlike many contemporary civilizations locked in constant warfare, the Minoans seemed to rely on the sea as their natural shield. Their power may have come not from conquest, but from trade, diplomacy, and cultural influence. Minoan art offers another window into their world. The frescoes discovered on Crete portray scenes full of vitality, people dancing, leaping over bulls, and celebrating life's rhythms. There are no images of battle or slaughter, but rather movement and joy. These visual stories suggest a people deeply connected to nature and the surrounding sea. It's a refreshing contrast to the warlike depictions common across ancient art elsewhere. Crete's position made it sort of a vital hub of commerce in the Bronze Age. The Minoans traded quite a lot, switching olive oil, pottery, and metalwork that was finely crafted with Egypt, the Near East, and various Aegean islands. Their ships sailed routes that connected coastlines across the sea, turning Crete into a bridge between different worlds. That back and forth enriched their culture, but then it also made things messy because they took on outside ideas while still trying not to lose their own unique character. Still, even with all those maritime ties, Crete kept a distinct kind of cultural style. The building materials and the art supplies were mostly local, coming from the island's own soil, really. That points to it that yes, ideas traveled by water, but the core of Minoan culture grew right where it stood. They weren't just copying foreign patterns, they were designers who built something fresh and pretty astonishing. And then there is that writing system, Linear A. It stays undeciphered, so their language and way of thinking are basically still wrapped in mystery. Because of that quiet wall, we only read the outlines of their civilization, so scholars lean on material traces, and also, more recently, genetic clues. With no clear written records, the palaces become a symbol as well as an enigma, glorious to look at, but unable to really speak for themselves. Understanding this society's achievements sets the stage for the deeper mystery of their beginnings, where ancient myths, historical guesses, and now science converge in search of the true story. Early theories on Minoan origins. From the moment British archaeologist Sir Arthur Evans began excavating Knossos in the early 20th century, the origins of the Minoans sparked intense debate. Evans named the civilization after the legendary King Minos and saw in their art and architecture something both extraordinary and foreign. The vibrant colors, flowing lines, and unique symbols reminded him of influences from Egypt and North Africa. He believed the Minoans might have arrived as settlers from those regions, bringing advanced skills to Crete. Evans's interpretation shaped decades of thought, as many scholars agreed that such an advanced society could not have developed entirely on a small island. They posited waves of migrants or invaders from Egypt, Libya, or the Near East, who introduced writing, palace design, and artistry. Some saw parallels between Minoan palace layouts and structures in the Levant or Egypt, reinforcing the idea of external origins. This migration theory seemed to explain the sudden blossoming of complex culture on Crete. Other experts pointed toward Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, as a probable source. They noted cultural and genetic similarities between mainland Near Eastern peoples and the Minoans, suggesting connections through migration or long-distance contact. The idea was that Crete had been influenced by or settled by groups moving westward from Anatolia. There were also theories proposing links to the Balkans, implying that northern migrations brought new technologies and art styles to the island. In contrast, not all scholars bought a migrant-only explanation. A few argued that the Minoan culture could be homegrown, growing gradually and kind of organically out of early farmers left to their own devices on Crete. They said, look at the local materials showing up again and again in Minoan sites, and also the continuity you can see in certain artifacts that seem to stretch back to earlier Neolithic communities. For these voices, the sea was less a highway for invaders and more a conduit for stimulation, ideas drifting in without any big mass movement of people, sort of. Then there were the mythic narratives around the Minoans, which only made everything more tangled. Some writers linked them to Atlantis, the lost civilization that's supposed to have sunk beneath the sea. The famous eruption at Thera, Santorini, nearby, helped feed that legend. So the Minoans ended up framed as shadowy survivors from some erased golden age. With these myths blur between history and fantasy, it became even harder to sort out what happened for real versus what's really just a story, you know. At the same time, the more careful thinkers about migration suggested the Minoans were clever adapters who took foreign concepts and modified them while still staying local in identity. Crete, sitting right among active trade routes, acted like a cultural sponge, soaking up whatever seemed useful and then reshaping it into something that felt distinctly Minoan. That could explain why their art and architecture show echoes of Egypt or the Near East, yet it doesn't automatically point to a foreign origin. Still, even with all that, critical questions stayed mostly unresolved. The undeciphered linear A script keeps their language and identity locked away. And since there are no direct records in the usual sense, the discussion could only travel so far. For decades, the Minoan story was basically pieced together from interpretation and speculation, which is not a small problem. The clues hidden in ancient bones have since opened a new window onto this age-old mystery. Archaeology versus myth and art. For much of the 20th century, the allure of the Minoan civilization sparked vivid imaginations and colorful stories that blurred the line between history and legend. Their palaces, filled with grand halls and radiant frescoes, seemed to tell tales not only of power, but of mysticism and wonder. This gave rise to myths linking the Minoans with the legendary Atlantis, a lost island civilization believed to have sunk beneath the waves. The dramatic eruption of the nearby island Thera, modern Santorini, fed this narrative, offering a natural explanation for a sudden cultural disappearance and adding a layer of tragedy to the Moorish past. Artists and storytellers focused on Minoan art's beauty and vibrancy, seeing in it echoes of distant lands like Egypt or the Near East. Some assumed that such sophistication must have been imported, or at least inspired by outsiders who brought advanced techniques and beliefs. The flowing lines, the columns, and religious symbols found in Minoan ruins were often viewed as proof that the island dwelled under far-reaching cultural influences. The sea routes connecting Crete to Egypt and Asia seem to confirm a picture of a civilization absorbing ideas from greater powers. Yet this view risks oversimplifying the Minoans as merely imitators or refugees from greater empires. Archaeological evidence shows Crete was not just a passive receiver of foreign culture, but a place where new ideas were fashioned and fused into a unique, distinct society. Locally sourced materials and distinctly Cretan artistic styles suggest a strong indigenous identity beneath those external touches. The island appears less like a colonial outpost and more like a creative melting pot, producing art and architecture that were enduringly original. Because the Minoan script, linear A, remains undeciphered, we cannot hear their voices or understand their stories firsthand. This silence leaves interpretation open to guesswork and myth-making. Without written records, every interpretation, whether linking the Minoans to Atlantis or Egypt, comes from external viewpoints. It complicates the task of teasing apart fact from narrative, history from fantasy. The geographical placement of Crete just deepened all that confusion a bit. Sitting, more or less, at the crossroads of Africa, Asia, and Europe, the island was naturally getting hit by several streams of influence and exchange. This whole web of connections brought up questions on how far the Minoans were nudged by outsiders, or if they grew up mostly on their own, in relative isolation. Every cultural signal, from architecture to art, could point toward trade, borrowed inspiration, or even migration, so any quick, neat explanation kind of falls apart. Some scholars keep a careful distance from sweeping ideas about migration or outright conquest. They suggested that cultural influence does not always require massive movements of people. In their view, Crete could be like a sponge, soaking in useful notions and then weaving them into a fresh cultural cloth, without really shedding its core identity. This approach frames the Minoans as learners and innovators, not just as plain receivers of foreign gifts. The sheer richness of Minoan art and myth also shows how strong stories can shape the way we interpret the past. There is a real temptation to connect impressive ancient societies to something legendary, like lost civilizations such as Atlantis. Sure, mythology adds to the cultural imagination, but it cannot replace scientific inquiry. The evidence tucked under those narratives still demands a more careful, more reality-based understanding. The connection between myth and material culture sets the stage for the groundbreaking revelations genetic research would bring. Because beneath every legend, there is a real story waiting to be told. The breakthroughs of ancient DNA. The promise of ancient DNA transformed the centuries-old debate over who the Minoans were and where they came from. For decades, the mystery was built largely on assumptions shaped by art, architecture, and guesswork. But recent advances gave scientists the ability to extract and analyze genetic material from ancient bones, offering a window into ancestry that no artifact could provide. Suddenly, the origins of the Minoans were no longer a matter of speculation, but of measurable facts. In 2013, a landmark study analyzed mitochondrial DNA passed down from mother to child from 37 ancient skeletons found on Crete's Lacythe Plateau. Published in Nature Communications, this research compared Minoan DNA with both ancient and modern populations worldwide. The results were surprising. Rather than showing strong genetic ties to North Africa or Egypt, as some old theories predicted, the Minoans were most closely related to early European farmers from Neolithic Greece and Western Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. These findings challenged long-standing ideas, directly contradicting early assumptions that credited Minoan origins to migrants from Africa or the Near East. Instead, the genetic data revealed deep roots on Crete and the surrounding regions. The people who built palatial complexes on Knossos and Phaistos were largely descendants of the island's early farmers, who had settled there thousands of years before Minoan civilization rose. This placed the Minoans firmly in the local continuum, rather than as newcomers carving footholds from foreign arrivals. Further research in 2017, led by Harvard's David Reich and published in Nature, expanded this picture by examining genome-wide DNA of 19 ancient individuals, including both Minoans and Mycenaeans from mainland Greece. The study showed that Minoans and Mycenaeans shared about 75% of their ancestry with early Neolithic farmers from Western Anatolia and the Aegean region. The remaining ancestry came from populations linked to the Caucasus and Iran. This suggests that while the Minoans were mostly indigenous, there was some limited genetic input from Eastern groups, likely over long periods of contact and trade. These results also demonstrated a close relationship between Minoans and Mycenaeans, hinting that the two civilizations, though distinct, shared a common genetic heritage. The slight difference involving Eastern ancestry among the Mycenaeans may reflect later mainland influences, but both populations trace their origins back to deep agricultural roots in the region. This helped dismantle earlier ideas of the Minoans as isolated or entirely foreign. In 2022, an even more detailed study combined DNA with isotope analysis of Minoan bones, looking at strontium and sulfur elements that reveal where individuals spent their childhood. Most tested individuals were local to Crete, confirming genetic continuity with the island's ancient inhabitants. A small number, mostly from the later Minoan period around 1450 BC, showed non-local isotope signatures, indicating they grew up elsewhere before settling on Crete. These outsiders likely represented traders, craftsmen, or elite visitors integrating selectively into Minoan society, not large-scale immigration. This nuanced genetic and isotopic evidence paints a picture of a stable, locally rooted population that was open to selective connections with outsiders. The Minoan civilization was not a transplanted culture, but rather a proud, self-made society built over millennia. Their creative achievements arose from their own hands and imagination, not merely borrowed from distant lands. The next step will reveal precisely what this genetic evidence tells us about the Minoans' true origins and how it reshapes history forever. What Minoan DNA finally reveals. The breakthroughs in DNA research have fundamentally reshaped our understanding of Minoan origins, revealing a narrative far richer and more complex than previously imagined. The genetic evidence consistently points to the Minoans as largely indigenous, their ancestry rooted deeply in the early Neolithic farmers who settled Crete thousands of years before the Bronze Age palaces emerged. This continuity contradicts old assumptions that the island's civilization was primarily the result of external invasions or mass migrations from North Africa or Egypt. Instead, the Minoans share close genetic ties with populations from Neolithic Greece and Western Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, underscoring a shared heritage that stretches across the Aegean region. Their DNA reveals no significant North African or Egyptian ancestry, challenging the ideas first proposed by Sir Arthur Evans and others who framed the culture as imported from those regions. This suggests the cultural brilliance of the Minoans developed locally over generations rather than being simply copied from abroad. Moreover, the genetic similarities between the Minoans and Mycenaeans, who succeeded them on the Greek mainland, highlight a longer story of human migration and interconnection around the Aegean Sea. Both groups originated mainly from the same farming communities, with only minor differences involving additional ancestry linked to the Caucasus and Iran. These patterns reveal a world where populations spread across and mingled within the region over millennia, weaving a shared genetic fabric that became the foundation of early European civilization. What the DNA also makes clear is that while the Minoans were not completely isolated, the limited genetic input from outside groups likely reflects small-scale contact rather than large invasions. This fits with archaeological evidence showing few fortifications or weapons, and a society whose power rested more on trade, skill, and culture than on conquest. Genetic markers of minority outsiders appear primarily in the later Minoan period, perhaps as traders, diplomats, or craftsmen coming and going rather than as waves of settlers. Isotope analysis of bones and teeth adds another layer to this picture, and it kind of confirms that most individuals buried on Crete were locals, who lived and grew up there. Only a handful show signs of having been born elsewhere, mostly showing up after 1450 BC, in a time when cultural interaction across the wider Mediterranean was really intensifying. This selective movement again underscores the Minoans' openness to exchange without losing their core identity, like not letting it slip away. The old idea of the Minoans as a transplanted people or conquered by others doesn't really fit the facts anymore. Instead, ancient DNA shows a civilization that was deeply embedded in its island home, built up from the descendants of the first farmers in the region. Their achievements in writing, art, and architecture were not some kind of gifts from far-off empires, but more like the result of long-term development and steady innovation rooted in local ground. So these new findings basically push us to reconsider how the Minoans created their world. Their culture wasn't a patchwork of borrowed bits, it was more like an original composition that emerged from a population that already knew its own land, its customs, and its neighbors. The island's position gave them connections, yes, but the center of gravity, the real identity and creativity, were homegrown. not imported, not forced. This leads naturally to the idea of a sophisticated hybrid society, where local roots and external connections came together to form the unique Minoan culture. A hybrid civilization emerges. The Minoan civilization was not a closed system, but rather a vibrant, dynamic society combining deep local roots with selective integration of outside influences. The genetic and isotopic data together paint a picture of a population that was mostly indigenous, but knew when and how to engage with the wider Mediterranean world. Rather than mass migration or conquest, this was a story of subtle cultural and genetic exchange. By the late Bronze Age, around 1450 BC, new individuals began appearing in the population who were not native to Crete. These outsiders, detected through isotope signatures, likely arrived as traders, craftsmen, or members of elite families participating in expanding networks of commerce and diplomacy. Their presence did not dramatically alter the genetic makeup of the island, but brought fresh ideas and skills, enriching Minoan society while respecting its foundational identity. This selective movement of people aligns with the archaeological record, showing increased trade and interaction throughout the Mediterranean during the late Minoan period. Crete's strategic location at the crossroads of Africa, Asia, and Europe made it a natural hub for such exchanges. The Minoans harnessed these connections without losing their core cultural distinctiveness, balancing openness with preservation. In many ways, the Minoan civilization exemplifies the power of hybridity, melding inherited traditions with adaptive innovation. This hybrid model moves beyond simple narratives of conquest or isolated development. It presents a society that was rooted in place, yet fluent in the languages of trade, art, and diplomacy that flowed across the Mediterranean. Importantly, this hybridity did not really dilute Minoan identity. The genetic continuity suggests that even while the Minoans exchanged ideas and welcomed newcomers, their population stayed mostly local, their cultural heart still beating hard on Crete. Their achievements in arts, administration, and religion show a society that felt sure of itself, comfortable with blending traditions instead of tossing them out altogether. The arrival of non-local individuals selectively also brings out how complicated ancient societies could be. It reminds us that civilizations aren't usually one single block. They're more like mosaics of people, thoughts, and movement, sometimes broad, sometimes very tight. The Minoans managed well with that complexity, crafting a life that was both steady and adaptable in practice. And this view changes how islands appear, not as passive receivers of continental influence. Crete becomes more like an active place of creativity, not just a stop along trade lanes. It was a crucible where ideas got reworked and where new cultural expressions surfaced. In other words, the hybrid nature of Minoan civilization reveals islands as spots for invention and identity rather than mere borders or gaps on a map. Finally, this model pushes us to look at other ancient cultures with fresh eyes. A lot of societies that were assumed to be side branches of major empires might instead have shown indigenous brilliance, shaped by selective contact, not wholesale migration. The Minoans end up as a kind of proof that hybrid identities can lead to strong possibilities and lasting innovation, even when the origins are mixed a bit. With this fresh perspective on hybridity and rootedness, we can now rethink the very origins of civilization itself and the forces that shape human history. Rethinking civilization's origins. The discoveries unlocked by ancient DNA compel us to fundamentally rethink how civilization arises and spreads. For centuries, historians viewed innovation as flowing outward from large established powers to smaller, dependent cultures. But the Minoan story turns that assumption upside down. Here was an island society, isolated yet connected by trade, that crafted its own remarkable culture largely from local roots. Their achievements remind us that innovation is not always the province of great metropolitan centers, but can also thrive in places others might overlook. This challenges the old model that emphasized conquest, migration, and cultural dominance as the main engines of progress. Instead, the Minoans embody a hybrid process where stability and curiosity intersect. Their island's geographic position provided both protection and openness, allowing ideas to flow in and be reimagined, not just copied. The Minoans learned from others but built their world in their own image, producing a civilization with indigenous brilliance and flexibility. Such a shift has broad implications for understanding ancient societies worldwide. Many cultures once thought to be offshoots or minor branches of vast empires might instead prove to be homegrown centers of creativity. The Minoans may be the first of many cases where later research uncovers deep local innovation layered with selective external influences. This perspective honors the agency, resilience, and inventiveness of smaller or geographically isolated peoples. At the same time, the genetic studies reveal that no civilization is ever truly isolated. The few non-local individuals found in Minoan burials hint at growing networks of trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. These limited migrations did not erase local identities, but enriched the social fabric through interaction. This paints a picture of civilizations as dynamic, porous communities, rather than rigid or closed-off entities. Even as Minoan DNA reshapes history, it still leaves behind these big, unanswered things. Ancient genetics can follow ancestry patterns, but it cannot truly decode belief systems or political structures, not in the way we might hope. And the meaning behind Linear A, this mysterious script, stays locked, like its own little closed room. So the Minoans' own voices about religion, leadership, and daily society are basically silent. Because of that, the whole human story stays half open, half mystery, and it keeps pulling people back for more investigating. Then there is the collapse question, the one around 1450 BC. The palaces were damaged, and the Mycenaeans rose up. So the scene shifts in a dramatic way. But DNA cannot tell us whether it was natural disasters, economic problems, or internal pressures that pushed everything over the edge. It's kind of a reminder that science gives answers, yet some mysteries stay put. They just sit there, maintaining that old-world intrigue of the ancient past. At the same time, the new genetic evidence pushes a more nuanced picture of how cultures get formed. It focuses more on the interplay between local continuity and outside influence, instead of clinging to pure origin myths. So it makes us recheck not only the Minoans, but also many other societies whose stories got shaped by assumptions about movement of peoples or cultural diffusion. With this different lens, histories across the world could look rewritten, even where we thought we already knew. In summary, we've uncovered how Minoan DNA reveals a civilization born from local roots, but enriched by exchanges, rewriting long-held ideas about ancient cultures and the origins of innovation. If this story fascinated you, please like the video and subscribe for more intriguing journeys into history's mysteries.